This is The Road Home, a contemporary exploration of the Buddhist path, written by Ethan Nichtern, read by Sen Naomi Kirst-Schultz. Chapter 4, Being Human, subtitled Buddha Nature and the Cocoon. Starts with two quotes. Quote, "It is not that the ego disappears, but that the belief in the ego's solidity, the identification with ego's representations, is abandoned in the realization of egolessness." Unquote. Mark Epstein. Quote, "That which knows confusion cannot be confused." Unquote. Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. Classic Buddhist tales of the journey of awakening hint at the irony of our commuter's situation. When they describe the nature of the human mind, texts sometimes tell the story of a poor man who doesn't know there is a treasure chest buried right beneath his dilapidated little house. He has to go on a crazy trip to find enough resources to scrape together his survival, only to eventually return home and accidentally discover the treasure buried where he sits. So, with our sense of irony intact, a question arises. Who exactly is engaging in this quote-unquote journey of awareness? Who or what are we at our core? What do we think our home, our very humanity, is made of to begin with? With no exaggeration, your view of human nature is perhaps the most important view you hold. What we believe about the nature of humanity actually lies beneath our spiritual views, our political views, and even our aesthetic views. Our idea of human nature has a tremendous impact on how we participate in our world. For example, philosopher Thomas Hobbes's 17th century statement of his tragically ominous belief that humanity's natural uninterrupted state is, quote, "a war of all against all," unquote, had a tremendous impact on the later economic thinkers who shaped the ruggedly competitive economic philosophies that guide so much of the contemporary world. What we believe about human nature is always the deepest script from which our expressed thoughts and actions are born. A quote-unquote view is the Buddhist term for the basic coding or framework from which our thoughts, expressions, and finally actions in the world are derived. A Sanskrit word for view, drishti, literally means our gaze. The crucial aspect of view is realizing that how we look at a situation, how we choose to gaze upon reality, deeply affects what we actually see. When we have only a commuter's relationship to our own mind, we don't always have direct access to the views that we hold. Even with practice, seeing our own views clearly takes a very long time. Rarely do human beings directly express their views of human nature. It's not often that we just say point blank whether we think humans are, at heart, basically good or originally sinful. What we directly experience are our conscious thoughts, which often contain fragments of underlying views. For example, after sending a message to someone asking her out on a date, you might directly think a negative thought like, "She's probably not getting back to me because she doesn't want to go out with me. Why would she go out with me?" More rarely do you think a conscious thought that includes a complete statement of a view of your nature, such as, quote, "My existence is inherently flawed and doomed. I am a cosmic F-up. My whole being is based on an original mistake from which I will never recover when I was born. I was already genetically damaged and spiritually broken, and because of all of that, I'm pretty sure she's not going to text me back." These deep and often pervasively negative views of our nature may only be revealed to us by examining patterns of conscious thought and behavior over a long period of time. Without meditation, we may occasionally perceive the damage caused by a few self-critical thoughts, or notice some of our sudden and harsh judgments of others, but we rarely put all the puzzle pieces together to see that underlying these thoughts and reactions is a deeply negative and acquired view of humanity. part of the power of meditation and reflection is that by repeatedly recognizing our consciously expressed thoughts, we have the opportunity to slowly trace back and begin to examine the views from which those thoughts are encoded. Once we have access to our views directly, we can begin to honestly and mindfully weigh those views against our lived experience, to determine which seem accurate and which seem problematic, false, or just too extreme. Once we know what we believe about ourselves, we can set about examining whether or not it is really true. This ability to put one's views to the test is the most profound outcome of a contemplative life. The view that human beings are inherently flawed, confused, and aggressive has proliferated throughout human history, across cultures, religions, and countless fields of quote-unquote secular inquiry. This view, which Pema Chodron calls the view of basic badness, has consequently had a huge invisible hand in shaping a wide range of systems within which we all live, especially the system of our own heart and mind. There's no way to avoid the following point. The Shambhala and Buddhist teachings stand in direct and total opposition to a view that human beings are originally sinful and fundamentally flawed. The Shambhala teachings say that human beings, all human beings, are basically good and endowed with inherent wisdom, Buddha nature. Here, quote-unquote good does not mean better than. Good does not stand in relation to quote-unquote bad, because there is no bad when it comes to human nature. Without comparison, good here means whole, pure, and totally worthy of existing. Tragically, many of us don't have trust in the basic goodness of humanity. Even more tragically, so many people I work with believe that basic goodness applies to everyone but themselves. If you have a hard time connecting with your own basic goodness, you are not alone. Far from it. It might be the greatest spiritual challenge of our time. What are the day-to-day effects of thinking we are fundamentally flawed? If we believe this, then materialistic objectification, i.e., spending as much time as we possibly can getting the hell away from dealing with ourselves, would be the only way to get even temporary relief from a basically flawed design. The logic of materialism extends directly from an underlying view of a sinful and corrupted humanity, even if we don't see it. The Buddhist and Shambhala traditions push hard in the other direction, using methods of direct experience as well as complex logical arguments to contend that the human mind contains inherent wisdom, and that our nature is whole, complete, and worthwhile. Therefore, whatever experiences we have must also be whole, complete, and worthwhile. Thus, basic goodness applies to the mind as well as to every phenomenon the mind encounters. If we weren't innately intelligent, then how would we be able to verify any progress along our journey through life? How would we ever know that any spiritual insight we have is legitimate, the real deal? Without innate wisdom, wouldn't any journey along a spiritual path just be a comedy of errors, the blind leading the blind? If we didn't have inherent wisdom, could we recognize wisdom in anyone else? How would we decide who to follow or why? There has to be something already active within us that knows what home really feels like, and that can reliably verify the true experience of being at home in our own awareness. If you fall in love with a teacher because you think that she is an awake and compassionate being, it means you also have that same potential in your own mind. The phrase, "it takes one to know one," seems to apply. As Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche said, the fact that we know we are confused means part of us has never been confused. Let's say you just tried to meditate and totally spaced out for 10 straight minutes. It happens to all of us, even us pros. The fact that you know it was about 10 minutes means that part of you was present the entire time. When you are lost in thought, what knows you are lost? Something within your heart and mind is already fundamentally awake and available. Something within you is never lost in commute. This means we already possess the inherent ability to understand our dilemma and experience the freedom that comes from living in our awareness. If not, we truly would be screwed, and any spiritual fix would just be a facade, a cosmetic surgery to buy a doomed patient a little more time to go through the motions. But we are not doomed. This innate capability to see clearly, sewn into the fabric of awareness itself, is the basis of our intelligence and our ability to feel compassion for the plight of others. This potential, the fact that, quote, that which knows confusion cannot be confused, unquote, is called Buddha nature. Traditionally, when Buddha nature is discussed, it is referred to as a seed-like quality of awareness, a kind of potential energy of consciousness, a basic soil from which powerful qualities can slowly flourish. The fruit of this potential energy, the actual substance that flowers, is called bodhicitta. Bodhi is another word for awake, and chitta is the Sanskrit word that I have been translating as heart-mind. Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche referred to the potential to connect with this awakened energy of consciousness as our enlightened genes. Again, Buddha nature and bodhicitta are descriptions of the mind. Basic goodness is a description of the mind and all phenomena. For each of us who engages in this practice, there are moments along the path where we catch glimpses of our own awakened nature and actually begin to believe in our own capabilities. Taken together, these glimpses build trust in the journey and give us great boosts of energy to keep showing up to the present moment, showing up to our practice and showing up to our life. Just a warning about glimpsing your own awakened nature. It's really not that big a deal. Sorry. There are rarely halos or fireworks involved in these powerful moments. Usually, they are just moments where we notice our ability to handle our own mind differently from how we used to. Momentarily, we experience ourselves as capable of dealing with our feelings, whereas once we felt inadequate and overwhelmed by whatever emotions we experienced. As our practice develops, we begin to string these moments of awareness together until they eventually become continuous. I remember a moment for myself, maybe the most powerful experience of glimpsing my own awakened nature that I've ever had, a moment where an insight about my own awareness led me home in a deep and clear way. It's about 5 years ago, 15 years after my committed meditation path began, and 8 years since I embarked on the strange path of teaching Buddhism. I am sitting on an airplane around 2 a.m. somewhere over one of the Dakota states. The flight is an overnight red-eye carrying us back to New York from the West Coast. I've been on the West Coast for a while, teaching people as best I could what my tradition has to offer about dealing with your own mind and helping others. Before takeoff, all the TVs in the airport played a cable news channel on mute, showing images of an Earth gone crazy, a surreally beautiful yet broken world reported on by people who seemed shiny yet unhappy. There is a couple sitting next to me in our row, and I gleaned just before takeoff that they are headed off to their honeymoon somewhere in the Caribbean, with a brief morning layover in the fabulously romantic Newark International Airport. Now, 2 hours into the flight, they are already arguing with each other in the dimmed cabin light, throwing back and forth the kind of passive-aggressive whispers that make me fear their marriage may already be doomed. My flight will land at 6:03 a.m. Eastern Time. I'm wondering if there is anyone I can text when the wheels touch down. Having recently gone through a breakup I didn't initiate, I realize there's no one there, not at that hour at least. I have dear friends, I have great parents, but none of them will respond to the sound of their phone rustling at 6 a.m. There are various markers of loneliness that the modern world offers for all us weary commuters, but perhaps the greatest one is realizing there's absolutely no one there for you to text. If you have no one to text, then you are truly alone. I am groundless at 35,000 feet, feeling tremendously alone. A wave of intense sadness crests in my body, and I feel the tears creeping out. I feel my deeply habitual resistance to actually letting myself feel. But I let go of that, and I am crying now, turning this flight into a literal red-eye. The sad waves go on for a while, longer than any grown man would hope to cry on an United Airlines Airbus. Truthfully, this might be the most intense sadness I have ever experienced. Of course, I would like to say the saddest moment I experienced came at the most politically correct time to feel sad. You know, a moment of deep grief at the loss of a teacher, or a moment witnessing the insanity of war, or a moment confronting the horrors of systemic poverty, or mourning the heroic death of one of our great saints, like Nelson Mandela. One of those times when people of good conscience are supposed to be sad, when heroic tears are appropriate. Because of the work I do, I hear stories daily of people's desperation, traumas, and grief. I see torments on the news I may never have to face. There are real problems in the world, and I'm still caught up in my own petty melodrama? The experience of genuine sadness is never quantifiable. There is no chart dictating the correct frequency of feeling, the measured serving of grief proportionate to the event at hand. If there is one thing this path has taught me, it is the truth that every single experience is valid. Instead of judging whether or not my suffering is deep enough to qualify as legitimate suffering, I decide to work with the moment as it is. I am sitting now, sitting up tall in my seat, extra tall amongst all the weary travelers, their seats pushed back to the maximum so they can try to sleep. I am placing my attention on my breath and my heart center, grounding my body in the middle of the sky. There are many techniques I could use right now, many that the tradition offers. Instead, I choose to just sit and feel. Feel my own vulnerability, feel my own openness, feel myself soaring through the air, uncertain about what home even means right now. After all, every breath I have ever followed, every loving kindness meditation I have ever done, every mantra I have ever recited, have all been preparing me to bravely face simple moments like this one. As I sit, I remember a voice in my head. It is my father's voice, spoken through gentle thoughts. The voice is transmitting the old Tibetan Lama's words, and therefore transmitting an entire lineage of wisdom. The voice reminds me of one simple truth that carries me through the rest of the flight. I live in the center of my awareness. When my flight touches down during a gray and nondescript New Jersey sunrise, I don't feel any less sad, but I do feel open, thankful for this wacky human life and ready to deal with whatever comes now. This feeling that life is truly workable lasts all the way until the next time that I forget. This is the experience of bodhicitta, awakened heart-mind. Every time we remember to live for a moment in the center of our awareness, especially during or after difficult emotional situations, we are connecting with the very basis of our awakened mind. Fundamentally, bodhicitta can gently witness and accommodate any experience that arises in the mind. It is an open and unshakable awareness. To borrow a phrase from Jacques Derrida and Heidegger, bodhicitta reminds us that we are, quote unquote, always already okay. In relationships, bodhicitta is what allows us to actively care for ourselves and nurture others. Bodhicitta is the ultimate validation of human experience, whether our current experience is pleasant or painful. When we live in our awareness this way, we live within a kind of normalized profundity that we don't need to construct. We don't go chasing sadness, but when it visits our home, we realize that there is honesty and deep love within that tenderness. We don't go provoking anger, but when it arrives, we realize that it is a valid mind state that can lead to the correcting of an injustice. The same could be said for how we could experience desire, jealousy, or any other emotion we have a hard time making room for. It really is as simple sometimes as sitting up and being present for a difficult moment when your habitual mind wants to cave in to doubt and habit, even at 35,000 feet. Understanding the quote-unquote ego and the cocoon. At the same time that we discuss basic goodness, Buddha nature, and bodhicitta, we also need to discuss the acquired views that obscure or compromise our ability to live fully within our awareness. We need to talk about confused notions of who we are, mistaken views of the self. To do so, we need to discuss one of the most misunderstood ideas in all of Buddhism. This is the Sanskrit concept of anatman, often translated as quote-unquote egolessness, and sometimes as quote-unquote non-self. If we misunderstand non-self, we might think that there's actually no person who exists, no heart-mind to ever come home to. However, the teachings on Anatman in no way contradict our existence or the fact that we each have a personality, preferences, and individuality. Instead, Anatman delivers a critique of a particular way of viewing the self, a mistake with huge consequences for how we experience joy and suffering. The fact that we exist is pretty obvious. I am Ethan, for now, and it's nice to meet you. In fact, our quote-unquote existence is the very basis of this journey. To claim anything else would be to engage in the kinds of strange sophistries that always made my head hurt, the brainiac arguments, stripped of any clear relevance to experience that can turn people off from studying Buddhism altogether. To me, Buddhist teachings are only meaningful if they positively inform the way we live our life. But here's the question about existence. What is the nature of our existence, and have we adopted harmful views about who we are? A lot of the brain-twisting wordplay that arises in Buddhist philosophy has to do with a misunderstanding of the word that gets translated as quote-unquote existence. If we want to understand what is actually meant by non-self, we have to understand how Buddhist philosophy is defining the meaning of quote-unquote existence, because it is a specific view of existence that Buddhist thought critiques. When normal people say they exist, what they mean is pretty straightforward. But the Sanskrit word for existence, svabhava, means something more like independent existence or existence from its own side. It literally means something like self-emerging, self-becoming. Svabhava refers to the impossible idea of an existence without context. What the Buddhist teachings remind us is that our sense of self never arises separately from the defining contexts of interdependence and impermanence. If we try to solidify the self to make it permanent, or try to isolate the self from its relational context, then we run into big problems. These moments of stuckness, these moments of quote-unquote frozen self, are the basis for all our defensive karmic strategies. From this freezing of quote-unquote me, the entire human history of materialism arises. Buddhist schools of philosophy critique this notion of permanent and independent existence pretty heavily, and for good reason. The teachings from the middle way, Madhyamaka philosophical system, say that the self cannot exist in terms of the following three conditions. It cannot be 1. Permanent, 2. Independent of context, or 3. Reducible to a singular entity. The fact that we as human beings never meet any of these three conditions is actually pretty easy to establish, at least logically and in a calm moment, free from the trigger of a habitual reaction. However, we study and contemplate the truth of non-self not to be logical in moments of quiet reflection, but to prepare for moments of stuckness and conflict in the heat of daily life. We study philosophy in order to slowly learn to recognize and transform the moments where we are habitually triggered, moments where we cannot live within our own awareness. In these moments of solidification, logical clarity usually goes out the window, leaving us to react as if we existed without context, as if we were permanent. In these triggered moments, also called klesha, afflicted reactions moments, we basically tell interdependence to go F off. When thinking about the solidified self, the quote-unquote ego, I often get the image in my head of the Stay-Puffed Marshmallow Man from the classic movie Ghostbusters, who comes to life and runs amok, unleashing havoc on New York City. While moments of stuckness usually cause us to experience the self as thick, puffed up, and generally bad for you, just like a marshmallow monster, it's crucial to note that this stuckness is rarely, if ever, a positive feeling, even in the moment we get stuck. Classic texts point to the experience of solid self as having a narrative of extreme self-importance, a feeling of being at the center of the universe, somehow better than everyone else. While it is true that moments of solidification make us feel at the center of everything, in my experience, as well as in the experience of almost everyone I work with, we feel insecurity and inadequacy when our sense of self solidifies. Solid self, as one student put it, is like seeing yourself as the, quote, piece of shit at the center of the universe, unquote. The experience of self as process, or anatman, which we glimpse when we live in our awareness, usually has a harmonious balance of humility and confidence. We are humble because we realize there is actually no center of the universe, and we are confident because we know we are capable of meeting the present moment adequately. It's usually the case that if you feel good about yourself, if you feel you are genuine and authentic, then you are experiencing this fluid self, the self as process, not as a marshmallow monster. Sometimes Mipam refers to the recognition of quote-unquote egolessness as having a healthy sense of self. While this may appear to be a contradiction in terms, it illustrates a crucial point regarding how we tend to feel about ourselves when we solidify a self-image, and how healthy and balanced we feel when our sense of self is more fluid. For the sake of distinction, we need a word to describe the totality of our habits, our afflicted or obscured sense of solid self, that which we are trying to bring to light and, over time, let dissolve. Sometimes, spiritual thinkers use the word ego to describe the source of our problem. The Buddhist teachings also use the Sanskrit word Atman to refer to the fictional self, the self that we keep imagining exists permanently outside of any context. However, egolessness means that in those triggered moments we are reacting to something that isn't really there. So a massive linguistic problem arises when we refer to the ego as an entity that does really exist in Buddhist terms, imagining ego as some problem to be overcome or destroyed, because the Buddha's whole teaching was that he could never find such a solid entity no matter how hard he looked. Using the word ego, we also run into other problems in conversations with Western psychology, because the meaning of ego, as understood in Buddhism, is completely different from its meaning in the Freudian triad of id, ego, and superego. Language matters if it leads to confusion about how we view ourselves. In this case, language matters quite a lot. Viewing ego as something to destroy on the one hand, and gently seeing that solid self never ever existed on the other hand, can lead us down two very different spiritual paths. The first is a path of self-aggression and chasing ghosts. The second is a journey of awareness that leads us back to a healthy sense of self experienced in context, a self understood as a process, not as a statue. If we try to destroy the ego, we proceed from a nonsensical premise that the Buddha never taught. It's sort of like saying, quote, "My unicorn is a total freak, a complete jerk, and it's causing me tremendous problems. I need to kill it. Sorry, unicorn," unquote. The Buddhist psychologist Mark Epstein makes a valuable distinction between the fictional, solid self and the self as process by referring to the first as our representational ego. The fictional ego is representational because it solidifies self-images as defensive patterns of karma. On the other hand, self as process can be seen as including a more functional or contextually existing aspect of who we are. In other words, Buddhism only critiques the stuck self-image, not the functioning, feeling, experiencing aspect of personality. If we are going to study Buddhism and use the word ego to describe the mind, making this distinction will avoid a lot of confusion and will prevent a lot of unnecessary unicorn abuse. Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche seemed to see this linguistic problem and came up with a beautiful and poetic analogy for the solidified or representational sense of self, the sum total of our habitually triggered reactions. Instead of referring to it as ego, as we discussed in Chapter 2, he called it our cocoon. Again, calling the stuckness of habitual reactions a cocoon puts a positive spin on a deeply entrenched problem. A cocoon is a protective space, a type of temporary home, created by a silkworm during its journey to maturity, a space in which to grow and transform. If the silkworm stays in this space too long, problems arise. The worm never faces the world, it never matures, it never grows up. This is what a stuck self-image does to our ability to live in the center of our awareness. At the same time, the cocoon is woven out of silk, This analogy offers an insight into how an innately wise and capable mind, Buddha nature, can coexist with deep layers of habitual confusion. Wisdom and confusion can coexist because the cocoon is made out of moments of frozen wisdom, moments of innate intelligence that harden and ossify into habits. Meanwhile, the material of the mind never ceases to be silken. It's like what happens when you put a pair of headphone earbuds in your pocket. You pull your headphones out a few hours later and they're tied in insane knots. Amazingly, it almost seems like there are more knots than there would be if you tied your headphones into knots on purpose. But we don't need a new set of headphones. We just simply need to untie the knots, and the music is beautiful once again. Becoming a warrior. For me, the moment of the red eye was a profoundly no-big-deal culmination of years of practice. It was also the culmination of helpful feedback from mentors, teachers, therapists, students, and friends. The moment we realized that it really is possible to live in our awareness could also be called a moment of warriorship, a heroic word that reflects a Tibetan concept of bravery. The key to being a warrior is being brave enough to repeatedly look honestly at your own heart-mind, to be fearless enough to keep challenging your own negative views of who you are. If we are willing to begin to feel fully who we are, if we are willing to begin to challenge millennia of negative views about human nature, and if we are willing to accept that we are actually wise and capable, then we can begin to lift our eyes and extend our practice of awakening towards others as well. This has been The Road Home, a contemporary exploration of the Buddhist path, written by Ethan Nichtern, read by Sen Naomi Kirst-Schultz. This was Chapter 4, Being Human. And that is the conclusion of Part 1. Next chapter we will start Part 2, The Journey of Relationships. Thanks for reading with me.